All right, everybody. Hello, this is Tina Rose, English Director with Advanced Kentucky. Welcome to our first English question and answer session. We're broadcasting live right now out of KSTC's offices in Lexington, Kentucky. We have quite a few questions to get to tonight. Thanks to a big shout out to Melissa Talent's English class, who are having, I think, a pizza party right now, and they're gonna watch all of the Q&A together, and they have sent me quite a list. So let's go ahead and get started. We're gonna be going back and forth between the questions and hang on just one second. We're going to go back and forth between the questions and me answering them. If you have any questions during the broadcast, you can still send them in. You might want to tweet them to hashtag AskTinaKY. And we have some people who are kind of keeping a lookout for that in case some extra questions pop up during the hour. We're scheduled to be on here from 8 to 9. So hopefully we'll be able to get through everybody's questions to then. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. And we will go ahead and start. Okay, so one of the first questions we got from a class was, why do you recommend taking the assessment even if you won't pass? What would you say is the best reward? And that comes from Jordan B. and Miss Holfelick's class in Louisville, Kentucky. And so what I want to address before I get into actually taking the exam is, why would you take this exam? The first thing is, we don't actually call it passing and failing. You can't really fail this exam. What you'll get is either a qualifying score that qualifies you for college credit, or you won't get a qualifying score. And the best reward for doing that is that it gives you practice in taking college level exams. You don't know that you won't get a qualifying score. If you took the mock exam and you saw what you did on the mock exam back in January, and you look at that assessment and how many multiple choice questions you got correct and what you did on your essays, you might only be a couple of points away from getting a qualifying score. So I really recommend that you take that information, you take the information that we go through tonight, and you think about, you have a really good chance of doing well on this exam. Okay, so let's go to some of the main questions. I've kind of put these things into categories. And the first category is time management. And this seems to be one of the things that students have a lot of trouble with. And we're going to go down through here because some of these questions are the same and some of them are a little bit different. What are the most important test-taking strategies? Of course, time management is going to be one of those. How can I speed up my reading? Speeding up your reading, knowing that a lot of the passages are going to be older passages, even something from the 16th and 17th century. The best thing that you can do for that is you can just read a lot of them and practice them. I often tell kids that reading these difficult passages is similar to when you're working out in the gym. If you're working a muscle all of the time, then that muscle is going to get stronger. And reading difficult passages is the same thing. So have your teacher find some extra passages from those older time periods and just practice reading them. At all? Okay. Well, we're not seeing... Anthony tells me we're not seeing the PowerPoint. So I'm going to switch back. Let's see if we can try again. Tell me if you can see it now. Here we go. Let's try this again. Okay. Okay, so should you review? Okay, let's go back. Sorry about that, guys. We're still on time management here. Should you read the entire passage thoroughly if you're a slow reader and do not feel you will have time to read all passages and answer all questions? Or should you read the questions and refer back to the passages? And that's a really good question. When you get the multiple choice section, you can read those passages in any way that you want to. And what I often recommend is that students go through the passages for about 60 seconds, take a look at them, determine which one of those passages is the most difficult for you, and save that passage for last. The questions are also the same, and here are tips for getting the most multiple choice questions correct. Kind of goes back to that. Not all of the multiple choice questions are going to be very difficult. If you're only going to have a handful of questions that are considered very difficult. And when you hit those questions, you know which ones they are. So just go ahead and skip over those, move on, and come back to those later. All of the multiple choice tests, the time management is really important. If you start at the very first passage and then you read that passage and go 1, 2, 3, all the way down through the questions like that, you might get stuck on one of the more difficult questions, and it'll eat up like 3 or 4 of your minutes. So you want to just pass over that. It's the same with the passages. You'll know which one is the most difficult one. They won't all be difficult. So get the ones through that you can get through and save the more difficult ones for at last. And don't leave anything blank, because you know that when you're doing multiple choice, you're getting credit for all of the questions you get correct. But if you get a question wrong, it doesn't count against you. So it's to your advantage to do it in this way. Will there be any passages before 1900? Again, I can never tell you what passages are going to be chosen, but if you know the syllabus for AP Literature, you know that there will be passages available. There may be passages all the way back to the 16th century. So that's a really good question. Moving on to poetry and verse. Let me make a little thing clear here. Technically, this particular question, when we get to the essay questions, is called the verse question. Sometimes we'll get a passage that isn't actually a poem, but is an excerpt from something that Shakespeare wrote. So it's still written in verse. It's not actually a poem, but it falls into that category. So what is my best tip for studying the poem that's going to be in the multiple choice section? Well, it goes back to what I told you just a minute ago. If that's the most difficult passage for you, then save it for last. But you're really going to want to call on all of the poetry analysis work that you've done in class, even the annotating of the text. You know, when you're reading through these texts, if you annotate as you go, it's going to make it easier to answer some of those questions. Should I review Shakespeare passages prior to testing? Of course, yes, you should absolutely do that. Reading Shakespeare is like learning a dance. If you're not familiar with the dance steps, it's going to make it a little more difficult when somebody calls on you to do it. So if you're not as familiar with Shakespearean passages and they tend to trip you up, if you read more of them and practice reading them aloud, then when you get those Shakespearean passages, it won't be as difficult. Interpreting poems seems to be the hardest part for me. What are some tips that I can use to help me understand what the author means? Often my interpretation is different. Well, it depends on whether we're talking about the multiple choice section or whether we're talking about the essay section. In the multiple choice section, you're going to have very specific questions that go along with that poem. And the best that I can tell you is that you have to choose from the answers that they give you. So just annotate the poem the same way you would when you're going to annotate for the essay, and choose your answers from there. This next one is interesting. I'm having difficult time understanding the poetry of Dickinson and Donne. I get it in class, but not on my own. Any tips? Studying poetry is one of those things where if your teacher has been giving you specific tools to get through poems, then what you need to focus on is the process. rather than one specific poem or one specific poet. If you're having a little bit of trouble with done, I can understand that because it's a much older form. His language is sometimes very difficult to get through. And Dickinson can sometimes be a bit, how shall we say this, vague, odd. So it makes sense that when you're discussing these things in class, you're getting it. The best thing, again, I can tell you to do is to practice more of those. The things that you find are difficult for you are the things that you should practice. And again, you'll hear me saying, I'm not going to tell you to study anything because it's really difficult to actually study for this exam. What you're going to do for this exam is you're going to practice things for this exam. A lot of questions about vocabulary, and this is something that comes up particularly on the AP Literature exam because the vocabulary can be quite difficult, especially when we get into 16th and 17th century texts. What can I do to improve my understanding of difficult passages? What is the best way to deal with words I don't know on the test? And is there any specific vocabulary we're required to use? Let's talk a little bit about dealing with words you don't know and understanding difficult passages. If you have been using harder texts in class, then you will have practiced looking at words in context. And so if you get a word or a phrase that is really difficult for you, the best thing you can do is look at the words and phrases right around it, because you should be able to get some clue as to what that word or what that phrase is trying to tell you. If you don't get it, read the rest of the section and see if you can get some clues later on. As far as specific vocabulary that you're required to use, I'm guessing that that's probably a question for the essays, and the answer to that is no. There is no specific vocabulary or type of essay or specific form of thesis statement or essay that is required. What is required is that you answer the question. Okay. So that brings us to the essays, and this is the one where it's what you practice a lot during the year. I mean, this is a writing exam. This is testing your ability to write and read analytically. So you've been reading a lot of novels, you've been reading plays, you've been reading poems, and you've been doing all of this literary analysis in class. And someone asked, what are the 10 most important literary devices? And I can't really tell you that. I'm really sorry. There are several devices that tend to be used a lot. One of those is metaphor, juxtaposition. I can think of maybe 20, but I can't give you the 10 most important literary devices. And I'll say this too, if you're reading a passage or you're reading a poem and you can't remember the literary device's name, let's say you see something and it's juxtaposition, and you cannot remember the word juxtaposition, but you understand that what you're seeing are two things side by side, and being side by side, it shows you how different they are. Well, that's juxtaposition, and as long as you point that out and you talk about how it's being used, then that's okay. You're not going to we're not going to deduct points. We never deduct points off of essays because someone couldn't remember a word. Should I read the essay questions in order, or can I skip around? Yes, you can skip around, but I would recommend that you take a look at them, just like at the multiple choice questions. Take a look at the 3 essay questions. You know which one is the most difficult for you. So if you know that the poem always gives you trouble, then you're probably going to save that one for last, and you're going to do prose analysis in the open question first. What steps do you recommend to avoid overanalyzing? And boy, this is something that a lot of kids really do, because sometimes the answer that you're looking for might be very simple. When I get to looking at some of these questions, I think if you just really focus in on what the question's asking you to do and not do more than what it's asking you to do, then that'll take care of that. And finally on this, do I have to write 5 paragraphs? And the answer is no. You don't have to write a certain number of paragraphs. Like I said before, there's no actual form or formula that we're looking for when we score the essays. Having a 5-paragraph essay under your belt as something to practice and something that you use to help you with your writing is certainly something that you could call upon. But it's not necessary, and we don't go through the essays and say, okay, this kid has 5 paragraphs, so it's going to be at least a 4. It doesn't work that way. I'll go over how they're scored in just a minute, and we'll talk about that a little bit. But once again, the main thing that you have to be able to do is answer the question. Okay, I'm going to take just a little second here to make sure we don't have any extra questions coming in on Twitter. And we're going to move on to the verse question or the poetry question. Everybody has a little bit of trouble with poetry. I think when I go to schools and I go into classrooms and I ask kids, you know, which one of these questions gives you the most trouble? And almost everybody always says, we hate poetry. And poetry shouldn't be that difficult for you. Just think of it as, you know, you've got a gallon of milk in one hand and a can of condensed cream in the other. Well, the short story or the novel is the gallon of milk, and the poem is the little can of cream. It's a whole story in just a few words. So do I have a method or a worksheet for analyzing poems? Should I use TP-Cast or something like that? I think you should use whichever form is best for you. And your teachers have probably gone over something like Diddles or TP-Cast, where you follow, you know, you look at the title, and then you read the poem, and then you look at the connotation of everything and all of the devices. If you take that strategy and you apply it to each poem while looking for whatever it is that the question is asking you to do, then you should be okay. And then we have that other Dickinson and Dunn question, which I think I've already looked at. What are some tips to help me understand what the author means? Once again, it's all going to fall back on the process. And if you look at this, I've got a question up here, and this will give you an idea of kind of how to really think about what the question's asking you. And this one says, read the following poem carefully. Of course, I don't have the poem up there, just to have this little graph for you. Then, taking into consideration the title of the poem, analyze how the poetic devices convey the speaker's attitude toward the sinking of the ship. So the one thing that you want to remember every single time you answer the poetry or the verse question is that the devices are down here, okay? The devices are down here. The devices are not the most important part of your essay. The devices are the tool to get to the understanding. So we want to know how the devices convey what? The speaker's attitude. So right here is the speaker's attitude. How do these tell us what this is? And so when you find all of the devices, if you find 2 or 3, let's say you find a metaphor, you're going to use imagery, and you're going to use repetition. How does the imagery used tell us what his attitude is? How does the diction tell us what his attitude is? How does the repetition tell us what his attitude is? So just make sure that you don't fall into that category of just listing devices, because that's going to put you in the summary mode, and it's going to put you somewhere in the level of an essay that scores like a 4. You always want to make sure that you understand what this part is in the question, and that's going to help you move above that summary phase, or a 4. A 5 is where you're going to get just a little bit of analysis in there. But if you find the devices and you tell them how they convey the speaker's attitude, then that's going to get you a little bit higher. Now, there's one more thing in here. It says, taking into consideration the title of the poem. So at some point in there, you're going to have to add another part to this and talk about the title. The title you could think of in this question would be like another device, something that the author used to let you understand what's going on. Okay? All right, so let's move on. And let's talk about prose analysis. The prose passages can sometimes be difficult. And let me show you a little something. If I'm sharing my screen, I should be able to show you. Let's see. Prose. Okay, so what I have up here is one of the prose passages from 1999 from Cormac McCarthy's novel. And the question that we had before was, should I annotate as I go? Absolutely. Absolutely, you should annotate as you go through these long passages. If you look at this question, it says, in the following passage from Cormac McCarthy's novel, The Crossing, the narrator describes a dramatic experience. Read the passage carefully. Then, in a well-organized essay, show how McCarthy's techniques convey the impact of the experience of the main character. So once again, we've got to look for devices. Show how McCarthy's techniques. That's just another way of saying devices. They're going to say it many different ways, but you're always looking for the literary techniques or the literary devices that the author uses to do something. And so for this one, it's show how he uses these techniques to convey the impact of the experience on the main character. So you're going to have to find, okay, who's the main character? What are the experiences? What's the experience this is talking about? And how are these techniques used to show me that? The only way that I know to get all of that in 5 minutes is to annotate as you go and as you read. All right, so let's go back to this. And let's look at how we do that answering the question for prose analysis. This is another question from one of the previous exams. The passage below is taken from the novel Tom Jones by the English novelist and playwright Henry Fielding. In this scene, which occurs early in the novel, Squire Allworthy discovers an infant in his bed. Read the passage carefully. You know they're going to say that every single time. Sorry about that. Read that passage carefully. Then, in a well-organized essay, analyze the techniques that Fielding employs in this scene to characterize Mr. Allworthy and Mrs. Deborah Wilkins. So once again, we've got to determine what our devices are. Those are the techniques, okay? Again, they're saying techniques here instead of literary devices. But that's what it is. To do what? Well, you've got two things in this one. You have to characterize two people. You've got Mr. Allworthy, and you've got Mrs. Deborah Wilkins. So really, it's a comparison contrast characterization essay. So you're going to have to compare and contrast these two people. And at the same time, you're going to have to say how the devices do that. Okay? That's the structure of your essay for that. All right. Let's move on. Let's talk a little bit about the open question, because I think I always get this question, how can I use Harry Potter? The big answer to that is yeah, you can. But the problem that most kids fall into is that they don't use one book. And Harry Potter is a series of books. And it's the same thing that happens with something like Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings is actually a very good set of books, but people forget that it's a series and they don't use just one book. And when you answer the open question, you have to use one book or one play. What does it mean, literary merit? I'm sure that your teachers have talked to you about this. I'm sure that they have had the conversation with you of what does it mean if something is of literary merit. And some would argue that Harry Potter is of literary merit, that Lord of the Rings is certainly of literary merit. What you're going to run into is if you do choose to use something like one of the books from Harry Potter, because it's more of a children's book or a young adult book, you're not going to have the depth in the work to use as some of your evidence when you're trying to write your essay. And I think that hinders you a little bit. So you should have gone over quite a few pieces in your year this year. And I'm sure your teachers have talked to you about specific works to have under your belt, okay? And finally, what are some good titles that work for any question? There are lots and lots of books that work for any question. So let's take a look at, no, that's not what I want. Let's take a look at some of the questions. There's some of those. Let's go down to the open question. And let's talk about importance of setting. So this is one that came up in 2006. This is a question of setting. Your open question is always either going to be about setting or character or theme or something like that. And if you look at the list of books down through here, some of the ones that really jump out at me are Huck Finn. Lots of people read Huck Finn. All the Pretty Horses, that's a fairly new one. Anna Karenina, As I Lay Dying. Going on down through here, Ethan Frome is a pretty good one. Frankenstein is very popular, and although it's somewhat of a difficult read, it tends to have everything in it that could pretty much go for any one of the questions that come up. Wuthering Heights, most people know how I feel about Wuthering Heights. I think Kathy needs therapy, and I think Heathcliff also needs therapy. And I don't see it as a wonderful love story. However, it is a wonderful book to use for this, and I always taught this book, and it has everything in it. It has the juxtaposition of the settings and the juxtaposition of the different characters, and it has everything in it that you could use to answer no matter what they throw at you. Their Eyes Were Watching God is another one. It's a really, really good one. Anything by Shakespeare is gonna fall under the this will work kind of thing. Hamlet works really well. Midsummer Night's Dream. Most of the ones on here. And if you'll remember, I'm sure your teacher has told you, and I'll tell you this, to remember that you don't have to use what's on this list. You might see something on this list that kind of reminds you of something else, but you need to use whichever book or play you feel most comfortable using. But just make sure that when you do that, you don't choose just one work and say, okay, no matter what, I'm going to use this work. And then all of a sudden, you get a question and it just doesn't quite fit. So have at least 2 or 3 works that are in your toolbox that will work with many different kinds of questions, and review lots of questions so that you can have an understanding of the kinds of questions that are going to come up. And I'm sure your teachers have been practicing those things with you. All right, let's see what else we've got. I think we're getting pretty close to the end of the questions that we have. So let me make sure that we have, make sure that we've gone those. Okay, so here's an open question. Let's talk about it for just a second so you know how to set up your essay. Many writers use a country setting to establish values within a work of literature. For example, the country may be a place of virtue and peace or one of primitivism and ignorance. Choose a novel or play in which such a setting plays a significant role, and write an essay in which you analyze how the country setting functions in the work as a whole. Do not merely summarize the plot. Yes, absolutely. Do not summarize the plot, because if you do, you're going to get a big 4, okay? Really, what they're asking you to do in this is they're asking you to talk about the setting and how it tells us what the work means, okay? So you're going to use the country setting. Oh, wait, that's not how it's going to look. Down here, you're going to have to talk about your evidence. And then you're going to have to say how that evidence functions in the work as a whole. So you're looking at the theme of the work, okay? What is your evidence when it comes to the setting? Well, let's say you're using Wuthering Heights. In Wuthering Heights, you're going to use the country. You're going to use the wild moors versus the more societal place of Thrushcross Grange. And then you're going to talk about how these two opposites tell us what the story is trying to tell us as a whole. And that's kind of how you would set that up. All right. So moving back just a little bit, let's see, let's go back to a blank page, because I'm going to just want to go over just a few minutes of how they're going to score your essays, because that's what everybody wants to know. So you know that we're going to have, keep using purple. I like purple. Okay, it's our Advanced Kentucky color. Okay, you know that everything is from 9 down to 0, and you can get a 0. You know how you can get a 0? You can get a 0 if you draw a picture, or if you write something that has absolutely nothing to do with the question, such as one essay I read last year, which was all of the lyrics to Bohemian Rhapsody. And I checked, and every single word in that essay of 4.5 to 5 pages was all of the lyrics to the Bohemian Rhapsody. And I thought, oh, this poor kid, that's really clever that that kid knew all of the lyrics, but I still had to give them a 0 because it had absolutely nothing to do with the question. So that's how you can get a 0. Most kids are falling into the 4 range when we're reading essays at the National Reading, and that's usually something of a summary. It's either summarizing the devices or summarizing what they just read, or summarizing the question and talking about it. The 5 is where you're half and half. It's uneven. It's got some analysis and it's got some summary. My pen is not doing so well. And then once you get up to the 6, you're writing analysis, and it's considered adequate. To get above a 6, now we're looking at really good analysis. We're looking at good vocabulary. We're looking at someone who really knows what they're doing. I got to go back to my screen. Can't find my screen anymore. Oh, let's see. Here we go. Really good analysis. Can't find it. It's not on. It's not on. When I stopped sharing it, it closed it. Mm-hmm. accidentally turned it off. There it is. Okay, sorry about that, guys. Am I back? Okay, cool. So let's take a look and see if we have any more questions on Twitter or on my email. Right now, I'm seeing that I do not. So I'm going to wait just a minute and see if anybody has anything else. I know Miss Talent's group is watching. I know Miss Talent's group is watching, and she says she doesn't have Twitter, but I know she has my phone number, and she can text me if they have any specific questions that they want me to address before we sign off. We're going to be doing a couple more of these. The night before the actual exam, we're going to be available via Twitter and email. I won't be live on the air, but we're going to be able to take your questions. If you have a very last minute question and you're freaking out and you want some last minute advice or something, you can tweet me questions at hashtag AskTinaKY, or you can send them to me to my email address, and I'll put that up in just a minute. Looks like we don't have any more questions. So I'm going to wrap it up, and I'm going to thank you guys for watching. We're going to be able to send you a link where you can watch this for students who weren't able to log in tonight or who weren't able to see this tonight. They'll be able to watch the video later on YouTube, and we'll be sending that link out later. We'll be doing another one next week for AP English Language. We also have lots of sessions coming up for calculus, for the chemistry class, for all of the sciences, and for statistics. And I think Monique is also going to host another session for calculus again. So if you need anything, you can email me at trose@kstc.com, or you can get me on Twitter. And if you have a question about the exam, it's hashtag AskTinaKY. And thank you guys for joining me. This has been great, and I'll see you again soon. Good luck on the exams. Bye.